I think I first heard about mewing and orthotropics back in 2017. I found the arguments for them convincing at the time, and it's been interesting to see mewing in particular become so popular in recent years. While many people have criticized mewing and orthotropics, a lot of the criticisms have been rather poor, and amount to little more than saying new ideas are bad because they aren't proven. So today, I'm going to bring you a rational critique of mewing, coming from the perspective of addressing the total body posture and use of self. For those who haven't heard of mewing or orthotropics, I'll give a brief rundown. Decades ago, an intrepid young orthodontist named John Mew noticed that traditional orthodontic procedures, which included extracting teeth and the familiar train track braces, were causing a significant drooping of the face and a retraction of the lower face. He decided to move away from the traditional orthodontic procedures and instead used widening appliances and appliances that encourage the patient to keep their mouth shut. He found he was able to get much of the same improvement in the alignment of the teeth without the harm to the facial structure. There were behavioral, essentially postural changes that were requested from the patient as well. You may wonder why keeping the mouth shut would be helpful. The reasoning is that mouth breathing is seen from the orthotropics perspective as a serious problem, and one that contributes to the drooping of the face, misalignment of the teeth, and general ill health. If you give a child an appliance that causes a small amount of pain when opening the mouth, the child will be taught to keep their mouth shut and breathe through their nose. If that sounds harsh to you, do remember that traditional orthodontics cause an immense amount of prolonged pain. The difference between these approaches is best seen in the results. At one point in John Mew's career, he partook in a study where twins with crooked teeth were given two different treatments. One would get traditional orthodontics, the other would get orthotropics. If we look at the pictures from the results of the study, we get a stark image of what Mew's criticisms of traditional orthodontics are. There are some who criticize the metrics used in this study, or claim that there is not much of a noticeable difference in the faces. Others say the data here is limited and could be cherry-picked. But it allows us to at least see the premise, as I do think there is a visible difference in the shape of the face, particularly in the lower end of the face. Mew argued that traditional orthodontics align the teeth by either pushing the maxilla or the mandible back instead of bringing them forward. This flattens the face back, making the face droop down rather than grow forward, and can lead to a weak jaw, weak chin, and an aesthetically less pleasing face. So what Mew offered was all of the benefit of straightening the teeth without the destruction of the face. The basic premise being that if the maxilla is widened and lifted forward and up in space, it will allow the lower face to grow forward or swing forward and not be retracted. Do you think this made traditional orthodontists change their practices? Do you think they addressed these concerns? They did not. They continued as they were, and they demonized John Mew, excluding him whenever possible. He was even fined by the NHS, though that was overturned by a judge. A very large percentage of modern people have crowded teeth, and these problems related to the facial structure and drooping of the face. Traditional orthodontics may exacerbate the problem, but orthodontics are used because a problem already exists. I've seen numbers that say more than half of young people in America get braces or other orthodontic work. This crowding of the teeth that is so common also explains why most modern people don't have enough room for their wisdom teeth. So while traditional orthodontics may be a problem, there's an even more pervasive problem plaguing modern people. Something is causing our faces to droop, our jaws to appear less defined, and our teeth to be crooked and crowded. John Mew's son, Mike Mew, went into orthodontics as well. Interestingly, he practiced traditional orthodontics for years. I think it's easy to understand that he likely did not want to take on the scorn and ridicule that his father was subjected to. It's quite a burden to stand firm against a popular and profitable dogma the way his father had. But after years of doing orthodontic work the typical way, He realized that what he was doing wasn't right. His father's criticisms were correct. Mike Mew has continued his father's work, and they have developed orthotropics, as they're called, an alternative to traditional orthodontics. They argue that modern orthodontics cannot explain the cause of crooked and crowded teeth. While genetics is often offered as an explanation, there is not good evidence to back that up, and even orthodontic textbooks admit that the etiology, or the explanation of the cause of malocclusion, is not known. The Mews point out that with typical orthodontics, retainers must be used forever if the changes are to be retained. In the vast majority of cases, if retainers are not continued, the teeth will become misaligned and crowded again. And perhaps their strongest criticism is of the extraction of teeth, which was commonplace and still is quite common as part of orthodontic treatment. If your solution to a crowding problem involves the removal of teeth and lifelong retainers, can you actually say you solved the problem? I 100% agree with the Mews' criticisms of traditional orthodontics. I can also say, as someone who had braces for more than 5 years as an adolescent, that braces do damage the face considerably. I've experienced it. I cannot condemn traditional orthodontics in harsh enough terms. I'm not going to get into the minutiae of whether or not orthotropic interventions work better than orthodontic ones. I will say both have their share of failures, and their successes, in my view, are typically not without issue. What I'm more interested in examining today is mewing. An important element of the Mews' arguments is that function has an effect on form. For instance, one of their most compelling arguments is that modern people tend to eat very soft foods as compared to the past. Man used to eat a diet that required a vastly larger amount of chewing, and so they had much stronger jaws in the past. They argue that is part of why older skeletons have relatively perfect teeth, with room enough for wisdom teeth, whereas a large aspect of crooked teeth is the crowding that occurs in modern mouths. There simply isn't enough room for all the teeth, let alone the wisdom teeth. The Mews wanted to create something that people could do on their own to combat this problem and improve their facial structure, something that didn't even require orthodontic appliances. The cornerstone of the Mews' perspective is the idea that your tongue should rest against the roof of your mouth. So the Mews created the practice of mewing, which is their most famous idea and the one that has taken the internet and world by storm. If we think back to this drooping face idea, we can understand this as the maxilla, which is the part of the skull that makes up the roof of the mouth, drooping back and down. This retraction and depression of the maxilla can obstruct the airway, and is what the Mews propose is at the root of this kind of melting of the face in modern people. The Mews argue that if the tongue is not consistently kept against the roof of the mouth, it is a malfunctioning of the tongue. The tongue is not doing its job of holding the maxilla up. Without that support from the tongue, they argue that the whole head droops and the shape of the skull is altered. Originally, Mike Mew described mewing as pushing the tongue against the roof of the mouth to push the maxilla up. Emphasis was put on getting the whole tongue to cover the roof of the mouth, not just the front end. Recently, it appears to me there's been a small change, in that it's no longer said that the tongue should press against the roof of the mouth, but that it instead should be suctioned to the roof of the mouth, as when making an sound, or the beginning of a tongue click. The suction idea was present before, but now, based on what I've heard from Mike Mew, it has supplanted the idea of pushing the tongue against the roof of the mouth. So mewing is the practice of putting your tongue up against the roof of your mouth. The idea being that this will keep your maxilla up, prevent drooping of the face, and improve your facial structure. From the Mews' perspective, the ideal oral posture involves the tongue being at the roof of the mouth. Here is where I must say I disagree with the Mews. I agree that the mouth should typically be closed and that mouth breathing is to be avoided. But I don't agree with this raising of the tongue. The question that should immediately come to mind when someone suggests that the tongue should be lifted to the roof of the mouth and suctioned there is, what is the other end of the tongue connected to? Strangely, I don't think I've ever heard the muse even mention the other end of the tongue. It's understandable that your average person might not really know much about the root of the tongue, which is the base of the tongue that you can't see in your mouth. But if we're going to change the position of the tongue in the mouth, we ought to know how that's going to affect the other end of the tongue. The root of the tongue is attached to the mandible, but also goes down to the hyoid bone, which connects to the larynx. Lifting the tongue to the roof of the mouth will lift the larynx. We can understand why quite easily. When we need to swallow food or drink, we lift the tongue to the roof of the mouth. That helps us pull the larynx up, which is a necessary part of swallowing. If you want to feel this happen, simply put your hand on your throat and swallow. You will feel the larynx go forward and up. The larynx must go up because when we swallow, we have to shut the airway. We absolutely cannot allow food to get into our airway, as that will cause serious problems. So when we swallow, we lift our tongue to the roof of the mouth to shut off the oral cavity. We lift the larynx to make it easier to close off with the epiglottis, and we open the esophagus, which is behind the airway. So when the muse suggests that we should keep the tongue on the roof of the mouth, in practice that means we are going to lift the larynx. It also means we are going to open the esophagus and partially close the airway. By keeping the tongue on the roof of the mouth, we are putting ourselves partially into swallowing mode, which will impair our breathing. In case you don't know, we are not capable of breathing and swallowing at the same time. Now, it is still possible to breathe with your tongue on the roof of your mouth, but you will be partially closing your airway and opening your esophagus. That is not at all what you want when you're breathing. I would expect someone who habitually keeps their tongue at the roof of their mouth to eventually have troubles with breathing and speaking, but also to potentially have digestive issues from the constant opening of the esophagus. I do not support the idea of keeping the tongue on the roof of the mouth. To me, that is clearly putting the mouth and throat into swallowing mode and partially closing the airway. However, if I did want to make a direction for putting the tongue on the roof of the mouth, I would certainly add that you want to keep the larynx low. In general, it's best to keep the larynx low, because that will keep the airway maximally open and the pharynx lengthened. François Delsarte, who was a great singer and teacher of singing, challenged the science of his time by insisting that the larynx should be kept low, even when singing high notes, something that was said to be impossible. And he was vindicated, as it's commonly understood now that lifting the larynx to sing high notes leads to voice problems, including hoarseness and loss of voice. I think the tongue should only go to the roof of the mouth when swallowing. But if I wanted to use this tongue to the roof of the mouth concept for something like mewing, I would definitely keep the position of the larynx in mind. If your focus is just on the body of the tongue in your mouth, you are going to pull your larynx up, and that's a bad thing to get in the habit of doing. The second major issue I have with mewing is the claim that the tongue holds the maxilla and the front of the skull up, and that without the support of the tongue, the head will collapse. Here's a question for you. If the tongue is connected to the mandible, and the tongue holds the maxilla up, what holds up the mandible? The tongue has to gain leverage from its base in order to push on the maxilla, which means something other than the tongue has to be holding up the mandible. The obvious answer is that the mandible is held up by the muscle, fascia, and bones of the head, neck, torso, and really the whole body. There is not some small individual muscle that causes your mandible to sit 5, 6, 7 feet off the ground depending on your height. Your mandible is held up by the large latissimus dorsi muscles, the glutes, the thoracolumbar fascia, the quads, the musculature of the neck, head, torso, arms, and legs, and all the fascia of the body interacting with the bones. So here's the next question to ask. If all the musculature, fascia, and bones of the body can hold up the mandible and the occipital bones and the neck, why wouldn't they also hold up the maxilla? Now, it could be possible that by some quirk, the tongue is simply meant to do this job of holding up the maxilla. But what else do we absolutely know for sure the tongue does? The tongue is instrumental in speaking and eating and swallowing. For speaking and eating, it has to be capable of articulating itself, forming itself into various shapes, and moving about. That is incompatible with the idea that the tongue must perpetually keep the maxilla up. If it was true that you needed the tongue on the roof of the mouth to keep the maxilla up, that would mean that every time you spoke, your head would start to collapse. If a teacher wanted to lecture for an hour, or an actor or orator needed to deliver an hour-long monologue, we would expect to see their head collapsed on their chest by the end of it. But of course, we don't need our tongue to hold our head up. We have large and strong muscles in our back, neck, and head that, in conjunction with the fascia and the bones, are perfectly capable of holding our head up if they're used in a reasonable way. These muscles are suited to this job, whereas the tongue has a more specific set of tasks it has to perform. And if we wanted to move the maxilla specifically, we also have muscles that connect directly to the maxilla. These muscles are chronically underused, especially in those who have had orthodontic work. Shouldn't we try using these muscles to move the maxilla before we use the tongue? This isn't to say that the tongue plays no role in one's posture or oral posture. Most people do narrow, twist, and shorten their tongue, which can cause a number of issues. But this idea that the tongue is a significant muscle when it comes to keeping the head up is just illogical. What would you rather have holding up your head? Your little tongue that also has to dart around as you speak and eat, or the enormous muscles on your back that, in conjunction with the fascia and bones, hold the rest of your head up? This confusion stems in part from the Mew's acceptance of the standard model of posture that proposes this idea of forward head posture as a major problem. Forward head posture is a highly flawed conception. The Mews have accepted a simplistic view that the head being forward is bad, and they advise things like chin tucks, which pull the head, face, and maxilla back in space. This is puzzling since the Mews also claim that they want to help people grow their faces forward and up. If you want the maxilla to go forward and up, why would you want to repeatedly practice pulling the face and maxilla back? Forward head posture is not even an accurate description. If we look at someone with so-called forward head posture, we can see that their head is back relative to the front of their body. This is more accurately described as forward midsection posture. But to be clear, postural problems do not exist in one specific location. If your head was out of place, the torso would also have to be out of place to compensate. In reality, it's the torso being bent and shortened that causes the displacement of the head. Now, you may have seen someone with what seemed like really bad forward head posture, and in every case, if you were to examine the torso of that person, you would see that they were bent and shortened. Pulling the head back does nothing whatsoever to help the torso. Instead, it will cause you to push your midsection, that is your belly, your lower ribs, and the front of your pelvis, even further forward out over your feet. I'm not going to dwell on this subject because I've covered it in other videos on my channel. But simply put, the standard model of posture that proposes things like forward head posture and rounded shoulders is wrong. It's as wrong as the standard model of orthodontics that leaves children with damaged faces. The Mews know that the standard ideas around orthodontics are wrong. They know that even the baseline of what is considered normal in mouth posture is skewed by the fact that most modern people have these facial structure issues. Well, guess what? The same exact problem exists in the posture world. Our baseline understanding of posture is skewed by the fact that nearly everyone is narrowing and shortening their torso, and the standard approach to fixing posture is as confused and lost as the standard approach of orthodontics. The Mews rightly point out that your general body posture is going to affect your maxilla and oral posture, but they are not informed about body posture. It's not their expertise, and so they defer to the standard model. That is a mistake in my view. But a fair question is, how come many people have seemingly benefited from mewing? I don't think that's actually difficult to explain. What mewing is encouraging is a certain engagement of the tongue. While I disagree with the specific directions used, it's obvious that a person who makes any conscious attempt to engage their tongue will likely see a benefit over someone who never thinks twice about how they use their tongue. You also can literally push the maxilla up with your tongue, just as you could with your thumb. That should, over time, move the maxilla some amount. But that doesn't mean that the thumb or the tongue is meant to be kept on the roof of the mouth all the time. Doing so would also cause you to continue to neglect the other musculature and fascia that should be keeping the maxilla up. The Mews weren't looking for a full-body solution because that's not what they know. They see this genuine problem in the face because that's where their attention is focused. They've assumed the solution will be in this specific area. So they've figured out that this kind of exaggerated swallowing gesture at least gets the musculature working. But have they taken into account the function of the vocal mechanism, the digestive system, and the breathing mechanism? Does this specific individual gesture get to the root cause of the problem? Think about it. Is the problem only in the mouth? Is the face the only part of the body that's drooping? No, we see the pelvis and the rib cage drooping. So why would the solution be localized to the mouth? We need to address the mouth, but we really need to address the whole body. The Mews understand this, but they advise you to just go with the standard ideas around posture. So rather than the postural work helping, you are trained to pull your head back and bend your back even more. What if you reorganized your torso so that it was no longer drooping and no longer bent? Would that have an effect on your neck and head? This brings me to my last point, which is both one of agreement and one that shows the differences between the approach I support and the approach of the Mews. The Mews want forward facial growth. They want to get the maxilla forward and up. And in that I agree with them. Most people habitually pull their head back and down, and that needs to be countered. This is why chin tucks, where you practice pulling your head back, really don't make sense. The Mews say that most modern people have a diminished airway, an underdeveloped jaw. Essentially, they're saying that something is missing, that people are missing out on some amount of growth, and so there is no room for all the teeth, and you also get these facial problems. But what I think the Mews are missing is that the position of the jaw, or any part of the body, is the result of the movements that you make with that part of the body. If you constantly pull your jaw back, you will have a recessed jaw. Not because your jaw will be underdeveloped, but because the jaw is being pulled back over and over. If you move the jaw, it will be in a new spot. I'm sure this is hard for some to believe, but your posture, including your mouth posture, is the result of the movements that you make. Form follows function. If you think this is how your jaw should be when you close your mouth, that is where your jaw will be every time you close your mouth. Now, many people think they're stuck here, that this is how their body is. There's an element of truth there, in that if you constantly pull your jaw back, the structures of your body will morph and scar to accommodate this habitual position. But the real problem is that your feeling sense will get used to it. Then it will become strange or even painful to move your jaw to a different position. And so you're stuck in a cycle. Because you won't want to do what is uncomfortable, you will keep your jaw pulled back. That is what is comfortable for you, and so, if someone observes you, they will see you with your jaw pulled back. However, with the correct directions, you can move your jaw, and your maxilla, and your head into a new position. In fact, to correct your posture, you will have to move your head into a new position, because your head is only where it is now to compensate for how you're habitually using your torso. It will feel very odd at first to move your head into a new position, but it absolutely can be done, and it will produce something that looks like growth, but is really movement. I want to be clear, though, that I'm not saying that this is a simple, don't even have to think about it solution. Orchestrating the correct set of movements to expand the torso and change the relative position of the head, mouth, and all of the parts of the body requires some nuanced thought and hard work. But if you follow a rational plan to improve the condition of your torso, and you bring the fascia of the body into action, you can get all of the change you want to your mouth posture without surgery, appliances, or practices like mewing, which I would argue harm basic functions like breathing, speaking, and digesting. Though to be clear, many people are already having issues with these functions due to their baseline habit, so I'm not saying mewing is necessarily going to be worse than the baseline habit. To summarize, the mews say there is a problem where the maxilla is coming back and down, and the face is drooping. I say the whole body is drooping. So rather than suction the tongue up to try and address the head, you should address the whole body. You should stop making habitual movements that shorten and narrow your back, and instead make movements that will lengthen and widen your back. Doing that will move your head in space and change how your musculature and fascia influence the bones of your skull. Shortening and narrowing movements have, over time, crunched and deformed the entire body, including the head. Lengthening and widening movements will, over time, return the head and the whole body to its correct shape and configuration. The problem is not a lack of growth, it's habitual shortening movements. Many of these movements are unintentional and subconscious. A person like this doesn't just appear to be pulling their chin and head back. They are pulling their head and chin back. Change the movements, and you'll change the posture. On some level, I think we all know this, in the sense that we know something about how we're using our bodies is causing this deformation away from optimal posture, both in the body and the face. If bad habits deform, good habits must reform. But is an exaggerated swallowing gesture a good habit to get into? Mike Mew says you should repeatedly swallow to initially get how to bring your tongue to the roof of your mouth. Does it make sense that we want to be in swallowing mode all the time, when we know that swallowing and breathing are functions that should not happen simultaneously? I agree with the Mews that a large percentage of modern people are dealing with these facial structure issues and crowded teeth. I agree with them that this can be changed without surgery, by changing your posture, by orchestrating the right movements. And I wish that the Mews understood that you don't need exaggerated swallowing gestures to get the maxilla where it belongs, if you use your entire body in a way that makes sense. If you want to know more about this approach of using coordinated movements to return poise to the body, so that your taut fascia can help you support your head forward and up to produce an open and unobstructed airway, please do return to this channel. You can also visit my website, mechanicsofpoise.com, for more information. Questions, comments, and criticisms are very much welcome in the comment section below.